What is technocracy? What is the overriding plan of the last 100+ years that you hear me talking about so often in Jay's analysis and in my lectures and in my series? Well, what I want to do now is give you the 20-minute boil down as I've been doing lately. So as you know, for the last several years, we've done a really in-depth analysis of 40+ works of the elite, particularly from the last century in relationship to the revolution that applies to all of life. This is the final revolution, the revolution of all areas of life to become unified under a technocratic global system. So what is that? How do we know what it is? Well, let's look at some of the works that are the most relevant, ones that we've covered extensively here. We're going to see the patterns that I've mentioned. So if we look at one of the first key texts, this would be Julian Huxley's, of the famous Huxley family. His summary of the program, the outline of UNESCO. UNESCO, he says at the very beginning, will lead to a worldwide foundation for a minimum universal basic credit system. He says that this will reconcile all oppositions in the world. There will no longer be dogmas, but rather evolutionary humanism and, quote, science or scientism, we would say. Neil deGrasse Tyson worldview will be the basis for everyone's faith. That will be the new faith. And you will have a strictly regimented, technocratic, dysgenics-based worldview. That's what this treatise says. That's explanation number one. Very clear, very concise, very to the point. Some of the same people's in his circle, right? The same people in his group, his elite circles, would be someone like H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells has two famous books, The New World Order and The Open Conspiracy. Both of these books cover the exact same subject, how to bring the world to this kind of a system. And wouldn't you know, he also says exactly the same thing, that science will be the new supreme council of the world that will rule. And it's not even really science as a kind of specific discipline. It's pure science. That is, scientism as a Royal Society mandated model for the globe. This is what H.G. Wells writes in The Open Conspiracy. He says all people will be mandated to follow this religion, and those that don't will have to beg for and plead for why they should be kept alive. And if you don't agree, Neil deGrasse Tyson will sever your head in a giant guillotine. In the NWO, H.G. Wells, back in 1940, wrote that the whole world would be converted over to a scientific dictatorship, and that the Fabian socialist slow model would be much more useful than any kind of top-down tyrannical order. Right at the end of this work, we have the Masonic plan for the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Man! So as we begin to see the summation that we get in these classic treatises is pretty clear. There's not a whole lot of dispute. There's not a lack of clarity as to what they mean or where we're going. And in fact, 100 years ago, they even mentioned the universal basic income, which, what do you know, right in the midst of this carunca, it's all being called for. All right, Yahoo just had an article the other day that, isn't it wonderful that carunca has revived the discussion of Silicon Valley and Yang Gang, about how we all just need to be on a universal basic income. Another one of the classic books that we covered in this series, Propaganda by Edward Bernays, who himself worked for the Department of War, which he renamed the Department of Defense. What does he say? He says that the future society will be run by science and a managerial technocracy, on page 127. Are you seeing a pattern here? A managerial technocracy. Now, as you know, in the last video that we did a few days ago, I covered both of these ones that are part of my series, the Impact of Science on Society and the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell. And I don't have to explain to you that, yes, Russell says the exact same thing as the people that we've just covered, that there needs to be a universal credit system based on people's social scores and so forth, and that this would be rolled out by some sort of centralized technocratic system. And thus the population could be under greater control. One of the key texts that I've also done that is oftentimes forgotten is Charles Galton Darwin. This was written in 1952, and it's called The Next Million Years. And if you read this text, which again, I did have a whole video, a whole lecture on this, at the close of the book, he explains that science will be the new religion of the future. And science will succeed because it will produce a natural happiness in man. He says that they'll even create a new religion of the future that will be a cloak for nothing but, quote, scientific Darwinism. And because it will give material comforts, this pursuit of happiness, back to John Locke, right? And because it will create a religion around controlling the populace, they can very easily and clearly reinstitute ancient notions of sacrificing to the gods. That's literally what he says. So we've covered this character, the famous Mr. Salk, and he says at the end of his book that the elite are those who practice science. Evolution is a movement of nature that requires the scientific elite, the priests in lab coat, to commandeer it and to steer it, and to thereby place environmental pressures to toxify and experiment on those in the environment to further evolution. Are you beginning to see that basically anything that happens or anything that's done is justified as just part of natural phenomenon evolution, and therefore just part of the natural progress of technocracy? We covered Friedrich Capra, right? Capra's book, The Turning Point, discussed how there would be a revolution in all areas of life away from the older models that were characterized by patriarchal, reason-based things, right? Science, medicine, and that it would turn towards an eco-based, new age, ghost in the machine style initiation of shamanic practices. Yes, shamanism would be the norm. And that this would be initiated through the counterculture movements, the 60s, the 70s, and so forth. And of course, that's exactly what Marilyn Fergan said in the Aquarian Conspiracy. The movement away from patriarchal ideas to the goddess and to the new age is central to the revival of eco-spiritualism and the technocratic new world vision. We covered other texts too, like God the Invisible King, where H.G. Wells projected a new religion, much like Charles Galton Darwin said about how in the future the religion would be centered around science, right? Exactly what we got in the figure of Arthur Koestler, Ghost in the Machine, who at the end of his book said that the new alchemy that would be the norm in the future, what we need to do, would involve a pill that everyone took to make them happy, literally what's in Brave New World, and adding specific chemicals to the tap water. Not only that, but also reversing and manipulating RNA and DNA. And that's on pages 334 through 338. And this, he said, would lead to the evolving of nature beyond the human, that we would move into the post-human era. In fact, the TRANS human era that was coined by the Huxleys themselves, right, is discussed at length in Kessler's Ghost in the Machine book, who was part of that inner circle. We have the book, of course, by Brzezinski, Between Two Ages, where Brzezinski explains that we are situated in the middle of the period, the transition period, the age of transition into the future technocracy. This whole book is about the future technocracy, and this is what caught the eye of David Rockefeller back when this was written in 1970. And then this led to Brzezinski being placed at a high-level position in the newly founded Trilateral Commission by David Rockefeller. We looked at the history of the Rand Corporation, the mind behind the entire Cold War era. The Rand Corporation essentially sold everybody on the Cold War, the bomb almighty, right? This kind of stuff. They created this matrix of how to dialectically steer and control minds throughout that whole period, culminating in basically selling things like Desert Storm, right? Iraqi freedom, these kinds of things. These are all dreamt up by this group. Pretty much the key central think tank in the world, right? This is crucial to understand because as Abeya closes the book with the modern American ideology, America as we know it in the last century, is essentially a creation of the Rand Corporation. And that's not these are not conspirafoil books. These are books written by the elite themselves, right? That's an authorized text. We covered works because I don't have an actual work that's specifically from Tavistock. Many of the Tavistock books are actually really expensive. We did cover a secondary work, Daniel Eslin's book on Tavistock, which just gives us an overview of this, basically a wartime institute that has continued to practice social engineering, right, and study social engineering. And we find the same thing there, right? The overriding ideology of the Tavistock Institute was also technocracy. We covered the Kissinger of France, Jacques Attali, in his book, Brief History of the Future, written in 2006, which actually predicted where we are now, right? It predicted the rising technocracy of 20, 30 years later. And here we are almost 20 years later after that book. And pretty much everything that Attali predicted has come true. We have lectures on every one of these texts. Let's also not forget that Julian Huxley wrote another book that a reader of my website recommended on living in a revolution, right? And this text is most relevant because in the first few chapters, Julian says that we're moving into the age of the social man. And the social man is a phase of world revolution. And the world revolution that's coming is this, right? Brave New World is the final revolution of all the revolutions back to the French Revolution, right? All the revolutionary periods, they all culminate, as Julian says on page 4, in the final revolution in his day, which was the creation of the social man. Socialism in the sense of a democratic socialism, a scientific democratic socialism, supposedly, based on empiricism, scientism, Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse McTysonism. It's the religion of the future. And it's fine if you want to have your new agey gobbledygook stuff, because that fits perfectly with this fake religion. That's why Aldous Huxley wrote this book and pointed out in his Berkeley interviews and his talks at Berkeley that the audience was too stupid to realize that what he's talking about is not fiction, but in fact a real plan, because his brother wrote the plan. We just showed you that with the foundational philosophy from UNESCO. Other books that are really relevant, we've covered and mentioned at times David Rockefeller's memoirs. David Rockefeller's memoirs include entire chapters on global governance, how to create global governance, his role, particularly chapter 27, in founding a lot of these international institutions, his connections to trilateralism, to Bilderberg, the CFR, his family's role in setting up those institutions, also covered in the famous authorized biography of Collier and Horowitz, that basically all those institutions have been set up by the Rockefellers and their family, all the way back to the OSS, CIA, CFR. All of those institutions that we now think of as premier globalist institutions were set up under the aegis of Rockefeller support. Now, in terms of technocracy, we can't forget the scientific core of R&D, which is the Pentagon's brain, DARPA. All right? We covered Annie Jacobson's 500-page history of DARPA. We did a whole, I think we did 4 lectures that analyzed this. And we learned how so much of even fiction, right, tied into how we understand and how we are being prepared for the technocracy. That's why people like H.G. Wells and Hollywood are so important, is because this is not just dry facts. It also ties into fiction. So this book, very similar to Abea's Rand Corporation book, Pentagon's Brain. And we covered the history of DARPA and all their super secret projects and all the madness that they were involved in, and how in many cases the battlefield was actually a test tube. Right? Simulations, large-scale simulations. Sound familiar? Have we seen any large-scale simulations lately? Now, in terms of the pharmacological angle of technocracy, we have Mr. Dolphin Love himself, Dr. Lilly, who bragged about wiping minds with LSD, wiping the minds of young people with LSD. Literal lunatics, like literal mad scientists running all this stuff. And explaining how the technocratic model is viewing everything in this mindset of mechanistic evolutionary processes, biometrics, and essentially the computer model. Life is a computer, and so therefore we can just reprogram everything. We also covered aspects of the CIA that related to things like Miles Copeland, the famous, yes, that Copeland, Game of Nations, where you thought after these hundreds of pages of dealing with his operations in Syria and Egypt that it would just be a spy biography. And what did it end with? It ended with techniques of the Council on Foreign Relations on bringing in technocracy. Exactly. That's the whole point of all of it. We can't forget, of course, the magisterial Tragedy and Hope, all 1,300 pages of Dr. Quigley that we covered in 8 lectures, which kicked off this whole series, right? And what did we say was the most important chapter? Not the chapter on the fractional reserve banking, but the chapter in the middle about technocratic managerial society and how that was the whole goal of all of it. We also covered his addendum, Anglo-American Establishment, which dealt with the inner society, the inner party that Orwell talks about, the inner select group of the elite, the top 13 families, according to Quigley, that at the beginning of the century were in control of the British Empire. That power structure then kind of morphed into the American Empire. We also covered another CIA analysis of using anthropology in academia, right? Spies basically that are academics or under the cover of or working for agencies like the CIA, studying things like anthropology in order to weaponize it. And again, along with that pharmacological aspect, we covered Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. Right? So we wanted to delve into some of the psychonauts. We've also covered large-scale geopolitical analyses of the Middle East with books like Afghanistan's Untold Story, with the importance of drug trade, the importance of geopolitical locations like Afghanistan being the gateway to Eurasia, especially in the Mackinder, Halford Mackinder model. We covered Devil's Game, right? The usage of radical groups, and we covered aspects of the Vatican as well, right? Dubious characters like Malachi Martin and his 800-page treatise. We also covered Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski. And we covered Wahlberg's postmodern imperialism, which we also found a lot of interesting details and insights in that relate to technocracy. So there you have it. That's basically what we're seeing right now rolled out with this big CV stuff, is everything that we've lectured on for the last 4 or 5 years extensively, directly from, except for a couple cases, the experts themselves, the elite, in their top writings for the last 100 years. And that's why we get MIT rolling out these articles saying everything that you've heard me say. If you want to see this whole lecture series, be sure and go down to my page. There's a whole playlist of the global elite, right? That whole thing. You can go through all these books. Actually, it's 50 plus lectures, 60 lectures. if you count all the Brzezinski lectures and the Tragedy and Hope lectures. And subscribe to Jay's Analysis and share. Let me know what you think. Thanks.